Hi everybody, welcome to our live event. My name is Brenda KB Anderson and today I have a sewing project for you guys. We are going to be working on the little mouse ornament. Here he is, isn't he adorable? So cute. So this little ornament guy, he was kind of born out of a thrift store shopping trip, and I noticed that there were a lot of gray sweaters, brown sweaters, neutral sweaters. I don't mind wearing those colors. I have some of those colors, but I was like, I wish there were sweaters in other colors. What can we do with all of these gray sweaters? And then I thought, oh my gosh, I know what would be the cutest thing is if we used the sweaters to make little stuffies. And then I was like thinking about how the holidays are coming up, and really I should be making an ornament, which would be a little more practical than just making a stuffy. However, I did bring along the stuffy version of this, just in case you guys wanted to see. It's exactly the same. The only difference is here is that this little guy is 175% of the size of this guy. So he's like 1 3/4 the size. So just in case you guys are watching this and also having the same thought, like wouldn't this make a cute little stuffed animal or a toy for somebody? It would make a really cute gift. All you need to do is take the same pattern pieces and then just use your copier and then put in 175% to print at instead of 100%. And you may need to cut apart your pieces and do a couple pieces at a time because it's going to blow them up into larger pieces, and it wouldn't all fit on the same page like it does in this pattern. Anyway, that was your little side note about the cuteness of this project. It's going to be really good for making, you know, ornaments for friends or little stuffies for some, you know, if you have any grandkids or kids who might appreciate this cute, or adults. Adults can love stuffed animals too. So today, you know, you could go ahead and download your instructions. This is the full instructions. There's a picture tutorial in here of the kind of trickier parts or things that I felt needed a little bit of explanation. But this is meant to be used in conjunction with this video because the thing I really love in teaching with the video format instead of just written instructions is that there are little things, especially when you're making creatures or critters, little things that you can do to make things look cuter, or just little tips that are really hard to write out. I mean, if I wrote it out, nobody would read it. It would be way too long and boring. But it's a lot easier just to watch somebody do it on a video, and then, you know, I can say something like, and squish it a little bit like this. I mean, that would be really hard to write out. So anyway, I love teaching in this style with the, you know, video, but also live. So if you guys have questions about things, if you have comments about things, you know, definitely put those in the chat so that I can answer them and address them during this live event. So. All right, so you've got your download available. That's free for everybody. And you can go ahead and download that. And then let me talk about the materials that you're going to be needing for this project. So like I mentioned, this was made out of a sweater. I'm going to pull the remains of the sweater in here so you guys can see what this looks like. So this is just the front of my sweater that's left. I have cut apart all the other pieces. But you can see here that this sweater is a pretty fine gauge. It's what I mean by that is there's a lot of stitches per inch, and I actually did list how many stitches per inch in the download in case you really want to compare. But basically you just want to look for a thin sweater, something that doesn't have a lot of texture, because when we cut apart all of our little pieces, if it's too thick, you know, it may start to ravel a little bit, but I have some tricks for that. But also, more importantly, if it's too thick, it's going to be hard to do this on the sewing machine. You could still hand sew it, but there are a couple little sections where you're stitching a lot of layers together. So really it is best to find a nice thin sweater. And luckily, these are very easy to find at the thrift store. And keep in mind, your mouse doesn't have to be gray. It could be, you know, there's multitudes of other colors your mouse could be. And it doesn't even have to be realistic colors either. It could be like a pale pink or light blue. That would be really cute. All right, so anyway, so I have this sweater. This is a size small, and this could make, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, probably about 8, somewhere between 8 to 10 mice out of just this one sweater. So this is, you know, a fairly inexpensive project. If you can find a sweater at the thrift store, you can make a whole bunch of ornaments and give them out to people, or you can have multiple little mice on your one tree, and you could put little different colored scarves, or maybe you want to make them hats or do some other sort of accessories to decorate each one. That would be like really, really cute too. All right, so the main thing is you need your sweater, and I am using an acrylic sweater here, but it could be wool, it could be cotton, although cotton I would, make sure it's nice and thin if it is a cotton sweater. I would be a little wary of using that because I feel like that fiber is going to be a little bit denser and it might be hard to stitch through. You could hand sew it though, once again, but it might be a little bit hard to get under your sewing machine with a lot of layers. Okay, so you'll need your sweater. You'll need some water and some cornstarch to mix up a starching solution because this is pretty stretchy, and sewing with this is going to get stretched out and kind of wonky. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually be starching our fabric, and I'll show you that process in just a little bit. But that's what the water, a spray bottle, and the cornstarch is for. We'll be mixing that up in just a little bit. And so you're going to need, in order to do the starching process, you're going to need an iron, some old towels, some pieces of muslin or some kind of press cloth or some kind of fabric where you're not worried about, getting cornstarch on it. It should wash out of just about anything, but, just don't pick your finest dress to do your starching process with. And then you're going to need a marking tool. I'm using this rinse away marking tool. It's just used, you can rinse it off with water. You don't have to have that. You could use anything that you can mark on your sweater with. It shouldn't be seen. You should, it could be a wash away marker, but it also could be like a pencil or a pen or something like that for marking the wrong side of your fabric. Let's see. You're going to be needing a little scrap of polar fleece, and that's what we're using for the scarf. So I have dimensions listed in the pattern for you, what to cut it out at. I believe it's 1 1/4 by 12 inches long, so just a little rectangle of polar fleece, and we're going to make that into the scarf. And then, let's see, what else do we need? Oh, I used a little bit of a worsted weight yarn for the tail. Here's this little tail. So this worsted weight is like a medium weight yarn, what you would, very easy to find that in a big box store. At least in the United States, this is the most prevalent thickness of yarn. But you can use a thicker yarn, whatever looks like it would be a good proportion to the rest of the little ornament. You can pick that out, and you could use gray, white, pink, whatever you have. So I'm using an acrylic yarn. You could also use wool. That works fine too. Let's see. Or you could use some sort of cord or ribbon or something like that if you have something else. Let's see, we will need a lighter or candle if you're using acrylic yarn, and I'll show you why. That's just to keep the yarn from fraying. And then some sewing pins. I like to use quilter pins because they don't get lost as easily. And then some sewing needle, and then also an embroidery needle and some embroidery floss to go along with that. I used black embroidery floss and this sort of dusty pink for the nose here. To embroider the features, so you're going to be needing those. And let's see. And then just something for hanging your piece. I'm using this sort of twine, this very rustic twine. I had this came off of some cardboard tags. So I'm going to be using this as something to hang my ornament. But you could also use something else like a cord, a ribbon, another piece of yarn. Maybe not in the same color as the tail because that might look weird. Your eye might connect those two and it might look like it's part of the mouse. So that's why I kind of like using something that doesn't really look like it belongs on his body. So that's why I chose this twine. But a ribbon would be lovely. Or just like another piece of embroidery floss would work as well if you just happen to have that. And then, of course, you're going to need the pattern printed out. The pattern is part of your download. It comes in your download. So just make sure when you print that last page, or print, I guess it's the second to the last page in this pattern, or in the written instructions, just make sure you don't print it out two-sided at that point, unless you don't care what you're going to be cutting up on the back side of it. Let's see, I think that is it for materials. I know that's a lot, but some of the stuff you may already have on hand, especially if you've ever made toys before, but embroidery floss and sewing thread and things like that, you might have all that stuff already. Oh, and I forgot to mention you're going to need a little bit of this polyester filling. So this is for stuffing him with. And I would recommend using that instead of little scraps of fabric or other stuffing materials because, well, I guess this depends on the fabric that you choose. My sweater was really stretchy and quite thin, so it might have shown little lumps if it was cut up I know sometimes people will stuff their toys with scraps of fabric, and I think that works really great, especially for wovens or other fabrics that don't stretch very much, but this is a pretty stretchy fabric, so it's a little harder to make that look uniform. Of course, you can try it, or if you've done it before and you have more experience with that, go for it if you'd like. Okay, I'm going to, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to prep this fabric. So you're going to need to starch it first. Otherwise, it makes the sewing part really tricky. Oh, looks like we have some hellos here. Hello from San Diego. Oh, love all your classes. Thank you so much for saying that. Would it be possible to do a session to explain the different types of crochet color work techniques like tapestry, mosaic, and when to decide which one to use? It's kind of confusing. Oh, that's a really good idea. Yeah, I'm going to file that away. I think that's actually a really good idea. Sort of like these are the different types you can use, and these are the areas where you would use them. Yeah, that sounds really like a really good idea. Thank you for your suggestion. I love it when people give suggestions. Thanks for the compliments, you guys. I'm glad you guys like this little mouse. It is really fun to make something that ends up being so cute. Okay, so first of all, you're going to want to put your sweater, or cut out a chunk of your sweater that you know is going to be about the size of your pattern. Let me pull out my pattern pieces so you guys can see. I've already cut these out, but I'm going to show them to you here so you can see the teeny tiny scale we're working on here. So we've got, and you'll just cut on all the lines in your pattern to cut out all of your pieces. So we've got the front, so that includes the head and the body. So this is the front. We're going to cut out 2 of these. This is the back, so there's the head, here's the body. We're going to cut out 2 of these as well. This little triangular piece sits right on the top of his head right here. So we're just cutting out 1 of those, and then the ears we're going to cut 4 because we're doing a front and a back, and then for both ears. And the arms we're going to cut 4 as well because we've got a front and a back of each arm. So there's 2 arms. All right, so those are your little pieces that you need to cut out of your pattern. And then you're going to cut out a chunk of your fabric that's about the size that you'll need for starching. The size you'll need for cutting out all of your pieces, rather. Okay, so I'm just going to cut a little chunk out of my sweater here so you guys can see the starching process. I like to save the ribbing at the bottom of my sweater because I like to make a lot of mittens out of repurposed sweaters. This is actually something I've done before for the National Sewing Circle, and there is a pattern and a tutorial for that if you guys are interested. But I usually save my ribbing for things like that, for putting on the cuffs of mittens. Okay, so here's my piece. I know I can get all of these pieces, even the doubles. Some of these have to be cut too. I know that for sure I can get them out of here. Actually, I'm going to cut this off as well, just because it's still connected to my sweater. Okay, and then I'm going to place this piece of sweater on top of some folded up towels. Like this. And then we're going to mix up our starch solution. So in this spray bottle here, I've got 1 cup of water, and we're going to use 1 tablespoon of cornstarch, and we're going to mix those together. And if you have a funnel, that's the best. You just pour it right into your bottle. I don't have a funnel, so I'm just going to kind of make one out of paper here, just ripping away a little notch. And then I'm going to do this and pour my cornstarch in. All right. And once you get your cornstarch in there, you can just shake it up. And then you're going to spray your sweater with cornstarch until it feels pretty saturated. You don't want it to be dripping wet. So I'm going to spray just a little on the front, and then I'm going to spray it more heavily on the back. So by the back, I mean the wrong side of the sweater. Whatever side you want to be the inside of your piece. And you don't actually have to spray any on the front. I just sometimes do that just to give it a little bit of extra stiffness, but it'll kind of, you know, soak through. So once, and you know, like I said before, you don't need it to be dripping wet, but you do need it to be fairly saturated. And then you can let that dry, you know, until it's just a little bit damp. I'm gonna skip that step here though. Just because we can't sit here and talk about things while we're waiting for that to dry. And then you can take a press cloth and just add it on top. And then it's gonna start to soak up the water kind of here. I'm just using an iron directly on top. And you're gonna wanna, and this is a medium heat, but you're going to wanna test this out a little bit beforehand because you just wanna make sure, especially since probably most of the sweaters you guys will find will be acrylic, and we just don't want to melt those. We don't want to cause any, you know, we don't want to ruin our sweaters. But I've done this with a few different sweaters, and I actually was surprised that the ironing of the sweater, when you keep it on a medium heat, it doesn't really seem to do much to the texture of the sweater. I was a little surprised. I thought it would make it maybe a little shiny or just not look very good. But yeah, it didn't seem to matter. Okay, so you'll do this. And then you'll check until your sweater is dry. Mine is not dry. It'll stick to your press cloth maybe a little bit. Mine is still damp, and this would take a little more time to actually get this to dry. But I can feel that it's like a little bit sticky, and it's starting to get a little bit stiffer. I'm going to move this out of the way though, and I'm going to show you what the end goal is here with your sweater once it's dry. It should look something like one of these. So I've got two examples here. This one is very stiff. You can see it's almost like, I don't know, it's like thicker than paper. I mean, it's stiffer than paper even. This one's very stiff. This one, it's stiff enough to work with, and this one feels a little more like, almost like felt or like an ultra suede feeling to it. Like it doesn't have the stretch anymore, but it's still a little bit floppy. So anywhere, you know, in between those two is perfectly fine. We just, basically the reason that we're using this is because we don't want our stretchy fabric to get all stretched out when we're sewing these little tiny pieces on the sewing machine. And we're gonna be sewing in some curves and things like that, and that tends to stretch things out, especially when you're kind of pulling on it to help it through the sewing machine, to help it turn and that sort of thing. So. All right, so once you've got your piece all starched and it's dry, then you can go ahead and trace your pieces onto the back, and we're going to be using that washable marker here. So we're going to need, oh, and I should mention, all of these pieces, none of these pieces include seam allowance, okay? There is no seam allowance included. So what happens is when we trace these pattern pieces out onto the wrong side of your fabric, you have to know when you're cutting around them that you have to allow for a little bit of seam allowance, okay? And I'll explain that a little bit more after I get this piece traced out. So you're just gonna be tracing right around the edge, and anywhere where you see these little notches, make a little notch in your fabric like this. Notch, notch, okay? And then when you pull this away, you'll have your piece all traced out. And just know when you cut this, you're gonna wanna cut it out with about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, or however much seam allowance you'd like. Even if you're used to larger seam allowances, because we're sewing these teeny tiny pieces, I really don't recommend using like a 5/8 inch seam allowance or 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you feel like, no, Brenda, I really need that, then go ahead and cut it out with that, and you may find that you need to trim it away later. When we're doing these little curvy seams, it really helps to have only a small amount of seam allowance on your pieces. So we're gonna trace out 2 of these. So these are the fronts. And I can see through, probably you guys can't see these lines, but I can see through my pattern pieces to those notches. There's 2 notches over here as well. Let me just check, yep. So there's one there and there's one there. These are notching for the arms. These are just how to put that triangle into the top of the head. So these are the fronts. And here is a back piece. That little notch is for the tail placement. And then we need 2 of these. Just remember when you're laying these down, just give yourself enough space. I feel like this didn't get starched very well right there, so I'm going to scooch this down just a little bit. Just make sure there's enough space to give yourself seam allowance between your pieces. And if you feel like, oh, I will never remember to do that when I trace those out, you can always, when you cut these out of your pattern page, out of the download, you can, always give it that little bit of seam allowance if you like. I really prefer, when I'm working with at a tiny scale like this, I really prefer to have my stitching lines drawn onto the pattern because, or drawn onto the piece that I'm cutting out, because when you're working with such tiny things and all these little curves, I feel like it just helps to see where you're actually supposed to be sewing, like you have a line to sew on instead of a certain distance away. All right, let's see. What I'm doing is I'm feeling how well this was starched here and moving it into a place that's starched a little more, because this one, there's a couple areas on here that I did not starch very thoroughly. So I'm just picking the starchier spots. That's why I keep moving things around. Okay, so there's one of those. There's going to be 2 of these. And here's a little cheat for this one. You can trace out just 2 pieces and then lay those onto a backing of a layer of fabric and then just cut around that. So that way you're cutting out 4, because you need a total of 4 pieces of the arm. So we're just going to trace 2 and then we're going to put them onto 2 more pieces of fabric. And I'll show you that in just a minute. I'm going to cut the ears out of this because I like my ears to be nice and stiff. Oops, I'm going to flip this over. Really, you don't have to flip the ears. They're symmetrical from side to side, so you can just leave them and cut them out like this. So again, with the ears, I am just going to be cutting out. I'm just going to be cutting out 2 of them, or tracing out 2 of them, and then I'm going to use those 2 traced out ears to cut out 2 more, kind of rough cut around. All right, whoops. So what I mean by that is I'm going to cut these out and then placing the right sides together. That's going to be 1 ear. So I have 2 layers right there, and then I'll do that for another one. Oops, I'm going to place the right sides together. And just sort of rough cut around them, because we can trim this off later. We don't have to worry about being too precise there. All right. Oh, and I've got to cut out doubles of the arms as well here. So let me cut out all these pieces. So you're just going to cut around them, leaving yourself that, about 1/4 of an inch. It does not need to be perfect. See how it's not really perfect on mine? Doesn't really matter. You're just going to basically cut around them, and then you're going to do the exact same thing with these arms. Cut them out, cut a larger shape around them, put them with right sides together, and cut them a second time. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to switch over to these pre-cut pieces, because I've already cut them out, because I knew with this project there's lots of little details, and I want to make sure I can show you all the embroidery and everything at the end. So we've got the 2 backs, the 2 fronts, 4 arm pieces. Okay, so these ones were traced, and then I just stacked them on top of another set. And same process with the ears. I traced 2 of the ears and then just cut a second layer for each of those ears. Okay, and then we've got the little triangle for the top of the head. All right. Okay, so let's get started with the sewing. I am going to do a little rearranging here so that I'm going to get rid of the pressing board I have. And we're going to start out by stitching or prepping all the little pieces first is how I like to do it. So I usually start with the arms. That's how it is listed in the directions. And with the arms, actually, I'm going to pull this pattern piece in here just to show you something up close here. So this little dashed line, this is where it's going to be seamed into the body through that line right there. So I added this little bit on just to make sure you would have extra seam allowance when we're adding that into the sides of the body. So when we cut around, here it is. We've cut around, I'm going to show you the other side. Let's see. Here it is. All right, here's where I traced. So I made a little notch right here, just reminding me that this is from here on over to the side. This is all going to be hidden inside the body. And so when we're going to do our stitching, we're going to start here and we're going to stitch past this line here and all the way around here. And I find that I'm able to stitch a little ways away here and still be able to turn it. If you're worried, if you're using something that's a little thicker or you're worried you're not going to be able to turn your arm, you can stop right here. I'm going to turn from here and go over to here and then stop here. Okay, so basically my path on the sewing machine is from here, around the arm, and over to here. I'm just going to do a straight stitch. And just, medium length. I actually kind of err towards a slightly shorter stitch length, especially if you're having any trouble going around those curves. Just because if you have a shorter stitch length, then you have more ability to turn as you're working. If it's longer, then sometimes it looks a little bit faceted when you're trying to turn. It looks, and you're not going to get as smooth of a shape. And actually for this arm, I'm going to start here, go in this direction, instead of starting here and going in this direction. Okay, so I'm going to place that, and you can go ahead and put some pins in here, especially if you're newer to sewing. I find that this doesn't really tend to slide around, and it's so stiff, it makes it really easy to sew, so I just stack them up and put them under the machine like that without any pins for this part. So I'm going to go ahead and start here. And there's no shame in going slow, especially if you're newer to sewing. We're starting out right here on a very small piece, and it can be a little difficult. So if you feel like it's easier, you can do it like this, where you're just turning the hand wheel, the flywheel on the side as you're working, especially if you're at a trickier point and you feel like you need a little bit, you really need to slow it down. But don't worry too much, as long as it's pretty close to that line, you should be fine. If it's, not completely perfectly stitched, it's not gonna matter because your fabric is going to have stretch. And I know we took all of the stretch out of it, but that's just for the part of while we're sewing it. So being able to stretch later is going to, that's gonna really help us in, fixing anything that got stitched a little bit wonky or a little bit funny. So don't stress about it. Okay, so we've stitched this line right here all the way around to here. And I'm going to go ahead and trim off, leaving a little less than 1/4 of an inch, or somewhere around 1/4 of an inch or so. And I'm going to leave a little extra here because it doesn't hurt to have extra right there. That's just going to help us. And then I'm going to cut one little snip almost all the way into that little corner. That's going to help us when we're turning it later. All right, so I'm going to place my And actually, you can go ahead and just do the same step on the other arm as well. So just go ahead and stitch that. And then you're going to take both of your arms and you're going to wash them under water. So you just kind of rinse them off and get them wet. Now it's up to you if you want to rinse a lot of that starch away or if you want to leave a little bit of it. For this part, for the arms, I usually just kind of rinse it for, 30 seconds or so, and until it's wet enough that you can turn it. Because it's so stiff once you stitch it, you're not going to be able to turn it very well because it's such a small circumference. And then we're going to turn our arm so it's right side out. It is a little tricky to get this going, but once you get like half an inch or so turned, then it gets easier. And you can use like the end of a pencil to push it in there to help you turn it as well if you're having a hard time, or chopstick or something like that. Here we go. Here it comes. All right, so you're going to do that with both arms. You're going to rinse them off. And then I take a little moment and just sort of mush it around like this with my fingers. And what I'm trying to do is get the seam allowances in there, which we didn't trim super close. And the reason I don't like to trim super close on these is because this is a knit fabric and I don't want it to start to unravel. But you're going to take a little minute to sort of shape it so that it doesn't have any like angular edges. And that looks pretty good. It looks nice and round to me. And then you're going to go ahead and stuff it. And actually, what I usually do at this point is I will squeeze out any excess that I have. I'm just going to grab my towel right here. I'm going to just squeeze out any excess that I have of the water just to let it dry a little quicker. And then you're going to go ahead and stuff the arms. So this, you will, unless you have tiny little pinky fingers like I do, which I could fit in all the way into these little arms, you're probably going to need a pencil. You can use like the eraser end of a pencil. You could use a chopstick. Anything that's kind of a small circumference like that, you can use that to help you get the stuffing in. So you just take a little bit at a time and push it down into the arm. And I definitely recommend doing this while it's wet, because if there's any starch in it, it's going to dry, and you want it to dry into a nice, pleasing shape. So you want to be able to basically be able to mold this with the stuffing in it while this is wet. Okay, and there's my little arm. It looks really good. So you do that for both arms, and then just sort of set them to the side while you work on the other pieces of your little mouse. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create the ears. So you're going to, again, you could pin this if you wanted to, but we're going to be stitching on the ear. We're going to stitch from this point around to this point right here. And don't worry about the dart. We're going to deal with that in a minute. I know that seems backwards, so just hang in there for a minute. And again, I'm just using a straight stitch. And I do want to go, back and forth at the beginning of when I start and stop on all of these pieces. All right, and now we're going to deal with that little dart. So don't worry that we didn't trace a dart on the back. We only want a dart on the front side. So we're going to open this up here. I'm going to put my finger in there. We're going to open this up and we're going to fold it where that dart is, and we're going to take a little tiny stitch here to sew up that dart on that's the front of the ear. Okay, so we have the little dart, and unlike the arms, you should be able to turn the ear right side out even though it's stiffened, because there's a larger hole right here. So go ahead and trim down the edge of your ear to just a little bit, maybe just a tiny bit less than 1/4 of an inch, like that. And then we're going to turn our ear right side out. And this will kind of, pulling on it this much might allow it to stretch just a little, but that's okay at this point. And we're going to do another little stitch line that goes around the edge of our ear. What we're trying to do is create, you may not be able to see the actual sewing, but you can probably see the little shadow it creates right here around the outer edge of the ear. And that keeps the outer edge of the ear nice and stiff, and it just makes a cute little, kind of a little, I don't know, almost like a cartoon drawing there. So we're just going to be stitching about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge there. You could just eyeball that. It doesn't have to be perfect. So whenever if you want to reposition your ear and turn it, if you're a little newer to sewing, keep this in mind. You always want to have your needle down in it so you can use the hand wheel, the flywheel on the side. Make sure the needle's down, and then you can lift up the presser foot and rotate it as you like, because that needle is going to keep it in its correct place, so it doesn't kind of slide to the side or something while you're trying to turn it. Okay, so here's our ear. The next thing we're going to do on the ear is we're going to fold the two sides in. Okay, so here's the little opening edge. We're going to fold them each in so that they meet up with that little seam where the dart is, like this. And then we're going to do a little stitch line about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge right there, or about where that line would be. It doesn't need to be perfect. So if you're like, I don't know where my line is, just stitch it where it looks like this would be a cute ear shape. Okay, so you're just going to do a little straight stitching here. And go nice and slow, because this is one of those areas where there's a lot of layers. And if you're worried about it, you can certainly use, just use your hand to hand crank it and go nice and slow. All right, so this is what our ear looks like right now. I know that doesn't look quite as cute and full, but that part is going to happen later when we kind of open this up a little bit like that. Okay, so you're going to do that for both ears and get those both ready to go. And then the next thing you're going to do is prep the tail. So for me, let's see, where did I put my yarn? Here it is. I am using acrylic yarn, and I'm going to, and I don't want it to fray. I'm just imagining, this will be around for a while. If you're worried about it fraying, you can use a lighter to just sort of melt the ends and kind of, I know this seems crazy to be touching that. You don't want to get the super melty and then touch it because you might burn yourself. But if you just wave it through a couple of times, and then you can kind of pinch the end of that tail in, that'll keep it from raveling. If you're using a wool yarn, if you happen to have a wool yarn, you can get your yarn wet a little bit near the tip of the tail, just a couple drops of water, and roll it between your hands until there's enough friction that it felts it. So this tail, just in case you guys are wondering, this is the larger guy. I actually made a braid out of 3 strands of a wool yarn. I just sort of loosely braided it, and then I rolled it between my hands with a tiny, couple drops of water, and then I felted it so that you can't really see the braid very much anymore, and then I felted the tip of it so that all 3 of those strands would stay together. So just in case you are using wool yarn, you can certainly do that to kind of prep it so that it won't unravel. And then you're going to tie a knot in your yarn about 3 inches away from the tip. So here's my melted tip. I'm going to tie a knot somewhere around here. Doesn't need to be perfect, again, you just kind of eyeball it. And that knot is going to go just to the inside of the seam on the body. So that one's a little bit short. That ended up about 2.5 inches, but that's okay. We're going to call it good. All right. So now we've got all of our little bits prepped, and we can go ahead and start putting together the front. So here's our two front pieces, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to connect them with the little triangle on the head. So these pieces will get stitched like this. That little notch right there on the nose, that goes to the tip of the triangle. So I'm going to go ahead and place that triangle behind here, and I'm going to poke my pin through and make sure it's coming out through the tip right there, and just pin it in a couple of places to keep it in place. Like that, and then we're just going to sew across there, stopping right at that notch. All right, now we're going to add the other side to right here. So I'm going to place it this way. And I'm just using my pins to make sure those lines are lined up, because we can't really rely on the edges because we just sort of eyeballed that. We are actually making sure that we are putting one line right on top of the other and using our pins to do that. Okay, so we're going to start there and go to the end. All right, so now we have these pieces put together, and we're going to sew the rest of the center front. So in order to do that, I'm going to place my finger in here and fold this triangle. Actually, I think we're going to do it this way. You just want to make sure, yeah, that should be fine. You can go ahead and just push this down so that you can fold this in half. And go ahead and throw a couple of pins in there. I usually just pin this where you see the notches for the most part, and then one more down here right on the end so we get that lined up. Okay, so we're just going to sew right here. So I'm in that little kind of corner where the neck is. You probably will have to reposition it a couple times because that's a very sharp curve right there. All right, and then I'm going to trim this just a little bit, especially where that curve of the neck is. I'm going to make a couple clips there, just not all the way up to your line, but maybe about halfway through that, quarter-inch seam allowance, about halfway into it. And then if anything seems like there's a lot of excess, I'm just going to trim this down just a little bit here. You can trim off anything where that seems like there's excess. And I don't generally, when I'm making these, I don't generally clip, except for little concave turns like that. I don't generally take notches out of anything or anything like that when I'm clipping and turning. I'm really just kind of trimming it for the most part. I don't feel like you need to take notches out of here or anything like that. Okay, so we have this kind of front-shaped piece, and that's all ready to go here. Oh, let's add the ears though. Okay, so I'm gonna grab some ears I prepped both of these ahead of time so that I would make sure that I had everything ready to go. So we're gonna place the 2 ears here and we're gonna sew them to the front. So the ears straddle over this seam on each side of the head. Okay, so one ear is gonna go here and one ear is gonna go here. So I'm gonna open up this seam allowance like that and just sort of finger press it with my fingers. So we have that open. Then I'm going to place this ear with the kind of opening on the ear. The front of the ear is going to go down so that it's touching this surface right here, like that, okay? And we're gonna go ahead and just seam that in. You can go ahead and pin it if you like. I'm just gonna kind of hang on to it and stitch right across here. And again, this is, a place where there is quite a bit of thickness. So, definitely go nice and slow, or if you're worried about it, you can certainly do this part by hand. But I chose a pretty thin fabric just so that, I wouldn't have to worry about the thickness of things. I really wanted to be able to do this whole thing, pretty much the whole thing by machine. All right, so here's the other ear. That's gonna go where that little seam is. So we're gonna open this up, split that open. Oh, we have a question that I missed. Can you use a spray starch that can be purchased, or do you have to make the starch? You should be able to use a spray starch. That should be just fine. I was just trying to cut down on materials that people would need to buy for this project, but if you already have that, you can go ahead, or if you want to buy it, of course you can. But yeah, you can definitely use a spray starch, like a pre-mixed, commercial spray starch. You can absolutely do that. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and stitch across here for this ear as well. All right, so we have those 2 little ears already stitched in, ready to go, and we're gonna stitch the back pieces together now. So we're gonna do the seam that goes along the center back, which is right here, along that curve, and right here, that's where we're gonna add the tail. So to add the tail, we're gonna place our tail in between the 2 pieces, and the knot is gonna go to the seam allowance side, okay? So the knot is gonna be on the inside of the body, and that's what's gonna help keep this yarn from just pulling out. So we just want to match that up as best as we can with that notch, both sides, and pin that in place. I'm going to pull that down so the knot is a little closer. There we go. And I'm going to put a pin right here in the neck where it curves in, and then a pin up here where we start. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and stitch that seam there. All right, so here is the back of our little mouse. Okay, and then we can go ahead and stitch the back to the, actually we're going to sew the arms to the back first. Looks like I didn't make my notches on this piece when I traced it, so I'm going to transfer them from the other side. So here's my arm notches. There we go. So I'm going to grab 2 arms that I made last night here. By the way, I have stitched the arms while they were still slightly damp. I have stitched them many times in my machine, but I would recommend you just wait until your arms are dry, or at least almost completely dry, before putting them in here, just because I don't want to recommend everybody putting wet things into their machine. That sounds like a bad idea, even though I do that. So you know, do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. So I'm going to place the arm right there, centering it as best as I can over those notches. It doesn't have to fit within those notches, but you know, those notches are there just to kind of tell you about where your arm should go. And keep in mind that the bottom of our arm, so this arm didn't get stitched in this direction here. I'm going to tuck those in a little bit. There we go. That point right there is where it should be hitting that seam allowance, you know, along the side of the body. So we're going to be placing that in the same, along the same line there. Okay, so we have a line right here on our arm. We're going to be stitching it right through to where the notches are. Just to get it all placed first before we sew the body together, the back together with the front. All right, and then here is the other side. Placing it where those notches are. And then, of course, you can pin that if you like. I'm just going to kind of pinch it and hold it until I get it under the machine. All right, so now we've got our back stitched together, we've got our arms and our little tail, we've got our front with the ears, and now we can go ahead and put them together. So we're going to place them together. I find it easier to just sort of push one into the other, like let them kind of both cup in the same direction. And I do actually, oops, I forgot, on the back we need to do these little darts first. So I'm going to fold that and then just put that under the machine and stitch a little here and do a little on the other side as well for that other dart. And you can sew that first before you put your pieces together if you like. I don't know why I like doing it this way better. For some reason, I just like to add the darts later. But it really doesn't matter what order you do that in, just as long as you don't forget, which is what I almost did just now. All right, here's the other dart on the back of the head. Just gonna sew that up. Okay, so now we're going to put right sides together. And I always try to kind of split open all the seam allowances so that you don't have quite as much bulk all in one spot. And I do actually use pins for this portion of it, for the most part. That dart in the back of the head, there's one on each side, that should line up in the center of the ear. And make sure when you're doing this that you have the tail tucked out of the way. You don't want to get that caught in a seam. Also, the ears, you just need to be mindful. Make sure the ears are, in the spot they should be, pointing in that way instead of being caught in your seam allowance. Of course, the arms as well. You just have to kind of, pin your way around and make sure that all the little pieces are where they're supposed to be. And nothing's going to get caught by accident in a seam. And I start and stop so there's about 1.5 inches or so of an opening between the bottom of the arm and then the foot. So for example, right here at the bottom of the arm, the underarm area, I'm going to start right here, go around, and then I'm going to stop after I come around that curve in the foot and just leave a little space open right here, and that's going to be how we turn him right side out. So making sure that ear is tucked out of the way. And if you feel like this is, you know, a lot of pins in here and you don't want to deal with turning a tight corners on the sewing machine, you can certainly stitch this by hand. I would do very small stitches or maybe go back and forth a couple of times if you're sewing by hand, or you can baste it by hand, take all the pins out and then run it through your machine. That's probably going to be even a little more sturdy. But I usually just leave the pins in and just go really slow so that I'm not stabbing myself with pins as I'm going around the corners. I mean, you kind of have to go slow anyway, just to make sure all the pieces are pushed out of the way and you don't have like an arm trying to come out or something like that. Okay, I'm going to start right here underneath the underarm section and work my way around, and I'm going to stop just above, just after I turn around the bottom of that foot. If you're worried you're going to forget and you're going to sew all the way around, then of course you should, you know, just put a little notch there or something like that so that you know, it's a visual cue to make you stop sewing. So whenever you're going over kind of a lumpy bit here, like, you know, we're going around that arm, or going over that arm, you're going to want to go nice and slow. Or especially where the ears are, because that's, you know, the most thickness is really where those ears are. So just sew a little at a time and just keep checking to make sure everything is in the right spot. I'm coming up on an ear here, so I'm going to try to go nice and slow. And I'm just making sure that that center seam that's from sewing the back two pieces together is split open. So we have, you know, thickness on each side. And here I am coming up on the next ear. Here's my next arm coming up here. So I'm just about done. I'm just going to kind of try and come up a little on the foot and back tack, and then we're good. Okay, so I always like to leave whatever seam allowance is right here. That's where we're going to be hand sewing it, so I don't trim off any from there. I'm going to trim off just a little bit of that extra arm seam allowance, and I usually end up trimming off just a little around the bottoms of the feet to help that turn a little better. And give this, I think, I normally don't clip this around the bottoms of the, you know, this underneath the body here, because once we get this wet, it's going to be very stretchy. So I'm not going to worry about that. I don't normally clip that. You could clip next to the neck on each side, but I don't normally do that either. If you're worried it's not going to stretch enough, but we'll see how it looks when I'm just going to trim it down just a little bit. I'm not actually going to clip it though. And I think this all seems pretty good. All right, so in order to turn it, you got to get it wet because it's really hard to turn otherwise, and that will allow it to stretch out. So you can go ahead and rinse it under water. And what I do is I usually rinse it a little bit, but I don't want to wash it completely because I really like to have a little bit of the starch still in the ears. The ears just look extra cute. You can really mold them with your fingers once you want to get this all turned right side out and you get it stuffed and everything. See how easy it is to turn once you get this wet? It makes a really big difference. Okay, so here's our little face, little ears, a little nose. And all those little seam allowances, even though some of them were a little bit bulky, it really doesn't matter. Once it's wet, it's very malleable and it seems to stretch. It really doesn't seem to need a lot of clipping or trimming. And for things like when you turn these feet, let's see if this happens on this one. If it looks like it's not very smooth, it looks kind of not a pleasing shape, just spend a little time and just kind of mush it back and forth and try to kind of get the seam allowance to lay nice and flat inside there first before you start to stuff it. Okay, so I get them all turned out. I check for any areas that may have, like something that didn't get stitched quite right. You can always hand sew little parts later too, because you can't put it under your machine when it's all wet like this. So I usually just if there was anything that didn't quite connect or something, there was still like maybe a little hole under the arm or something like that, you can just go ahead and hand sew that later. Mine all looks good. So I'm going to just kind of squeeze this out a little bit. I just get most of the moisture out and then I can start stuffing it. So as far as adding the eyes, you could, if you're using safety eyes, I didn't talk about the safety eyes earlier. I'm using safety eyes for the eyes of my little mice. So these are 6mm safety eyes. I believe these were 10. This guy is bigger, so he's not actually in your pattern. I mean, it is the same pattern, but I didn't list the eye size separately for the larger one because that's something I just thought of to show you. But I think these are 10. But the ornament that we're making here, these are 6mm safety eyes. And if you don't have safety eyes, or if you prefer to just use little tiny buttons, you could do that. You could also embroider your eyes, do some large French knots, or just some little stitches. You can also use beads. Beads will work great too. If you are using safety eyes though, like I am, you're going to want to place your safety eyes before you finish stuffing him. So I found that the first time I put my eyes in there, I really liked to have a little bit of stuffing in the head so I could kind of decide where I wanted the eyes to be. If you want yours to look like mine, same proportions and that sort of thing, I put my eyes just below that seam line between the sides of the body and the head, or the top of the head, just below the seam line on each side, and the eye sits about halfway between where the ear is seamed and the very front of the nose. Okay, so that's like the halfway distance. So that's where I'm going to place this one, but just know, you can move around the eyes into a different spot. It'll give them a different personality. If you were making a bunch of these little mice, it might be kind of fun to put them in different spots and just see what you like better. Or just have a variety so that it'll make them all look really different. Okay, so I'm aiming for just below the seam and halfway between the ear and the nose. So that's right here. And because I'm using this, kind of a lightweight, a thinner yarn knit sweater, you do have to sort of work the end of the safety eye in. Now I have it pressed against my finger. My middle finger is inside of him, and I can kind of turn it and see. Now there are some strands in the way, and you just can kind of loosen those up and try not to break them, and just kind of, place the tip of that safety eye through. So now I didn't break any strands. If you did end up breaking strands, you can wait until he dries, add a little tiny dab of glue on the back, a little bit of super glue, just to make sure that it doesn't run or cause a larger hole. And then I'm going to put the safety eye backing on. And the safety eye backing, you're going to put, this is sort of a bell-shaped back, and it's sitting with the largest circumference touching my finger right now. That largest circumference is going to be next to the fabric. So you just push it on until it's all the way on. And there's our little eye. And then I'm going to do another eye on the opposite side, trying to get it into the same place. okay, so that it looks about the same as this one. That'll probably be pretty good. All right, so I have the tip of the eye pressing against my finger. And then we just sort of have to sort out these little threads so they go on one side or the other of that backing, or the post, sorry, the post of the safety eye, and just kind of help them on. And doing this when it's wet, it allows your yarn to stretch out a little bit more. It seems like it's easier to put it on. Okay, so I'm going to place the backing on here. All right. Okay, so now we have a little eye on each side, and we're going to go ahead and stuff him. So I always start with areas that are furthest away. So I'm going to be placing this all the way up into the head. And when you do this, you don't want to put so much in there that you really stretch everything out. Keep in mind that this is actually wet, and so it's not going to, it's going to stretch more than if it was dry. And so you don't want to stretch it too much, but you don't, you just want to make sure you're putting enough in there to get it to be the right shape. Now, when I do this, you can see this eye is doing this weird thing where it's making a bump above here. That's because I'm pushing the post of the eye upward, and you can just sort of pull the eye out and push it down into that, just kind of make a little spot for it in the stuffing like that, when you see that happening. And don't be worried if he looks a little weird at first, because they always do. But you just have to, this is the part where you kind of have to feel like a sculptor a little bit. You just kind of put some stuff in there, and then you roll it around and mush it into the place that you want it to be in. See, remember how I told you at the beginning, I was so glad we have these live events for teaching, because it's so much easier to explain things when I can just show you. Because I really couldn't have written that, like, oh, you just mush the head like this, see? All right, so we want to make sure we're getting enough stuffing in the tip of the nose and in the head, and we're just kind of shaping it with our hands to give it the shape we want it. Now, this is kind of sticking out funny here, so we're going to add a little bit of stuffing in there in the back of the head. And that looks a little better. But you really have to take your time with this step and make sure that you're, really kind of pushing it into the shape that you want it to be in. Usually I kind of do this to the nose a little. I kind of like it when the nose turns up just a little bit. And then my next thing after I get the head is I like to go down into the feet. Make sure that I get them in there, kind of roll them back and forth when they get a little too stretched out. And then we're going to stuff the middle here, the belly. And make sure you get some in the neck so that it doesn't have a super floppy neck. Even though we're going to be hanging him from the top of his head as an ornament, especially if you wanted to just make a little stuffed animal, you would want to make sure that you're giving him enough stuffing in the top of in his neck so that he can hold his head up. And if it gets too stretched out, you kind of have to squish him a little bit there. And then I like to push my thumbs into the ear while making sort of this cup shape to give his ears that shape. And you can do that later on when he starts to dry a little bit, just to kind of block them. Because when when he starts to dry, he's going to have a little residual starch in him, and it's going to help keep all of these shapes that you're making. If you washed out all of the starch, you still need to shape it with your hands, and then you're just basically relying on the shape that he's in to, to stay in that shape. And it'll be just fine. You don't have to worry like, oh, did I wash out too much starch? Don't worry about that. But having a little extra starch in the ears is helpful, I think, to keep those ears, to be able to shape them. Okay, so I am going to be stitching up this little side seam here. So I've got a double-stranded, just a regular all-purpose thread here running through a sewing needle, and I'm just going to tie a nice knot in the bottom. And then I'm going to I'll start down here in the foot. So I'm going to come out a little ways away from where I want that seam to be. And the reason I do this is to make sure, as I gently pull on that I have a little bit of space before the sewing actually needs to be functional so that I could do a few little back stitches here, and that's going to keep our thread from slipping out. And then it can be nice and anchored by the time we actually start, sewing this together. So I'm just going to do a slip stitch between the two edges, and I just want to make sure that foot stays stuffed as I go. So luckily, when if you're using a fabric that has knit on one side and purl on the other, and if that makes no sense to you, that's okay. But if it looks smooth with all those little V's on one side and bumpy on the other, then it's going to want to curl in like this, and that's actually beneficial because that folded edge is where you're going to slip your needle through. So you're going to grab just a little bit of this side with your needle, take a very small stitch, and then grab a little bit of this side. Grab a little bit of this side, and grab a little bit of this side. And you can do this all at once by grabbing a little here, grabbing a little here, grabbing a little here, weaving it back and forth just to do a little slip stitch seam here. And it might seem weird that I'm sewing through a damp fabric, but I actually prefer to do it this way and get it all seamed up and then allow it to dry, because once it dries, that starch kind of stiffens it just a little bit, and it's going to make, if you do the stitching first like this, then you can really shape it. It's nice and smooth. Now I'm going back down along the same path. I like to do this twice, just to make sure it stays. It also straightens out the sort of zigzagginess if you go, kind of take the opposite path with your needle, if that makes sense, and that helps straighten out the zigzagginess that happens. There are actually some other seams you can do here that are a little bit more advanced. To do a very indetectable slip stitch seam, maybe we can do that in another video, but this one is just a little bit simpler, so I chose it for this project. All right, and then I'm going to use my needle to just make sure that stuffing stays down on the foot. I'm just kind of gripping, like I'm using my needle to pull the stuffing down just to make sure it stays there. Okay, so I'm going to do like a little French knot right here because I don't trust my knot to just stay in place. So I'm actually knotting it to my fabric right here. And then I'm going to weave it in and out just a little bit more so I can leave a longer tail. I don't like cutting my knot or cutting my thread tails right next to the knot if I can help it. All right, so he's all stitched up and super cute. And you can do any sort of final shaping and then just allow him to dry. And then you can finish up with the embroidery and the scarf. So let's do that. So this guy over here, I made him yesterday, so he's already nice and dry, and I can show you how to do the embroidery. We've got some more hellos, and thanks you guys for your compliments. Hi from Arlene and Azia. I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right, I'm sorry. And yeah, hi to everybody who's popping in here. We've got a here from San Diego. Let's see. Looks like we've got the same question from Deborah. I don't know if you missed that, but you can absolutely just use a regular purchased spray starch instead of making your own. Okay, so I've got a double strand of this, whatever color you're going to use for the nose, and I'm going to come in from underneath the chin here so that I have a nice long tail on the inside of his head, and I'm going to pop out just to one side of this little, basically we're focusing on this little tiny triangle at the tip of the nose here. So I'm going to pop out right there, right along the seam. And I'm going to pull this in until there's just a little bit left. We're going to just leave that hanging out there for a minute. And then I'm going to take a couple of small stitches back and forth on the inside here. And this is just to kind of anchor our embroidery floss in place. And we're going to cover this up in a minute when we start stitching on the top. So we're just kind of going back and forth just to make sure that nothing's going to be sliding out. Okay, so now we're going to just make a few stitches. I'm going to come a little further out so we can cover this up. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to make just a few stitches across the top of his nose, and see how there's those little tiny stitches? I just want to make sure I'm covering those up as well when I do this. So take your time when you do the embroidery, because it really, it really does help if you take your time and go nice and slow and do really neat little stitches. It does make a difference. All right, I'm going to do just one more stitch, and I'm going to come out of the chin. Make sure those are nice and straight. There we go. Okay, so I am going to just try to do a little stitch here in the groove, so that way I can actually leave a nice long tail. I'm going to come out over here along this. The reason I like to go in and out of the seams is because it's thicker there and there's more layers. There's a higher chance that you're going to snag a couple of layers of fabric there, and that's going to keep it from pulling out. There, we can kind of pull on that and make that disappear into that seam. I'm going to cut off this beginning yarn tail. I'm going to cut it pretty close to the chin, make it disappear in there. Same thing with this. Cut it off pretty close to the body. And then I'm using that to just pull it to the inside. All right, and now we're going to use the black. And I'm just going to use this single-stranded here. So again, I'm going to come in from underneath the chin, and I'm going to pop up somewhere where I know I'm going to cover this up. So I'm going to have a little stripe right underneath the peach of his nose. So that's where I'm coming out, right on the tip there. Okay, and I'm going to stop a couple inches before that disappears. And I'm going to take a couple little stitches in here, just kind of underneath the edge of the nose, just to kind of anchor this in place. And I'm going to come out over here along one side of his nose. So I'm just going to be making, I'm getting my needle ready to make a little horizontal stitch directly below that peach line, basically. So right here, I'm going to go back in right here, and I'm going to come out right in the middle, right along that seam. Okay, so there's the bottom outline of his nose, and then we're going to come straight down here. We're going to be making that into just a little stitch, a vertical stitch, and then I'm going to come out over to the side, and this is going to make a little smile line here. So there's that middle line, and then we're going to go back in directly. So this point should be about the same point, mirroring that, and then I'm going to come out at the very bottom of that line. And make sure when you're pulling this that this strand is under your needle. So when I'm pulling this, I'll slow down here so you can see what I mean. This strand is going to catch that loop. So that is what makes it into that little V shape. And then I'm going to go in just below to catch it. And I'm going to come out up above to make a little eyebrow over here. Above the eye. And this is just to make a cute little line that really helps with the expression. I mean, you can leave it without the eyebrows, but I really like these little eyebrows. So I'm straddling over, here's the seam line, and I'm just kind of going an equal distance from above the seam line to below the seam line. And then I'm going to come over onto the other side of, like above his other eye. And the eyebrows have a lot to do with expression. So the angle you place them at, how far they are away from the eye, all of those things will create, different expressions. Because if his eyebrows went down like this, he would look like angry little guy. So that's something to play with if you're into making toys and you want to make a different expression. Tilting the eyebrows really, it changes their expression drastically. That looks pretty good. Oh, I just realized I didn't do the little stitching between his eyes. Okay, I'm going to do that with this embroidery floss. So normally before I embroider the face, I do a little bit of stitching right here to bring his eyes further in. So I normally do that with a thread that matches the mouse, but because I already have this thread going, let's see if I can get it to come out. Actually, you know what? I'm going to do it with the correct color thread because I just feel like it's going to be easier to show you how you would do it, because hopefully you would remember to do that before this point. But if you don't, that's okay. It still works at this point. So I'm going to just do a couple little stitches kind of in the ditch here, just trying to catch some threads and making sure that this is not going to pull out, that the eyebrows aren't going to come out. All right, we'll go back to this white thread here. Oops, and we can go ahead and cut off that little bit. So this is optional. I mean, obviously he's still cute without this. But I really do like to add these sort of like little shaping in the face between the eyes. So I want to show you guys how to do that. So I'm going to come in from under here. You can come in really from any seam. You're just going to want to anchor it. Here I'm coming out in the face seam right there. I'm hoping that that knot will pop to the inside. All right. Okay, so we're going to come out. I'm going to go back in and pop out right in front of this eye. So there is actually a picture in your download because I was worried this might be a little hard to see. So I'm taking a stitch right in front of the eye here, and then I'm going to go through his head and come out right in front of the other eye, kind of trying to grab some of that bulk of the seam allowance. Okay, so now we have a thread connected right through the head. And when I pull on that, that's going to pull the eyes inward just a little tiny bit and make like a little dimple there in his face. See how that makes the eyes look like they're looking forward now as opposed to kind of looking out toward the side. Now this is something that, you know, a mouse might not have, but it makes it look very cute and adorable to kind of tilt those eyes inward like that. You're basically making a dimple here and here by connecting the thread tightly between them, if that makes sense, like that. Okay, so I'm gonna come out up here, and it looks like we're just pretty much out of time here, but I want to talk a little bit about the hanging loop and the scarf just really quickly, and then I'll let you guys go. Looks like we may have another question here. Oh. I can, wow, you are very skillful. I can't do it. I can imagine how my poor mouse would look like because I've never trained in sewing. You know what? You can definitely give it a try. You would be surprised how cute things can look. And you can always, with sewing, you can always clip your thread and pull it out and try it again. And with this project, you know, at least the investment in it is not that great. You know, the sweater is very inexpensive, so the materials don't cost really all that much. All right, so here we have this little guy. Like I said before, you're gonna have a little strip of polar fleece and you're gonna cut fringe into the ends. There's a little weird marking in my piece, but that's okay. We're gonna cut it anyway. So we're just cutting some little fringy bits to be the ends of the scarf. Like that. And they don't have to be perfect, really. Just snip a few times, maybe 4 or 5 times into each end, like that, so you get a little bit of fringe going, and then you can just tie it on. There's a little neck. So cute. And then as far as the loop goes at the top, you can use whatever you have, whether it's a ribbon, a thin ribbon, a cord, and if you have a needle with a larger eye, you can use that to poke through your sweater fabric. Another thing though too, and I guess I should have mentioned this before when I was putting the pieces together, if you have a wider ribbon, you can actually catch it in the seam line when you're putting the back of the body in together with the front of the body. You can catch it right on that seam and have it be done, or you can catch it when you're doing the two backs and sewing them together. You can catch it right here. Let me make sure that balances okay. Yeah, that'll balance just fine if you put the ribbon in just behind where that seam is. Now the reason I chose not to do that in this project is because I was a little worried that ribbon is going to get caught in the seam, and there were already things to look out for like the ears, the arms, and things like that, and I just figured that would be just another layer of things that you don't need to worry about. And doing this with a little needle is very easy, to just kind of use a needle to poke it through his head and then just tie a little knot, and then you can call it good. All right, so here's our little twin mouse. Got some little brothers here. All right, let me just make sure I didn't miss anything. All right, looks like I answered all your questions, I hope. All right, well, thank you guys so much for being here. I hope that you enjoy this project and make some super cute little mice for this holiday season. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Bye, everybody.